So the most important and profitable part of the Red Mill Museum Village was the rock quarry. The rock quarry provided limestone that they used to crush rocks for roads, to make mortar that was built to help rebuild Clinton after their devastating fire, to make fertilizer for all the farms that were nearby. And that was run by the Mulligan family. The office that you see behind me is one of the first state-of-the-art offices back then. It actually incorporated a scale that they could put the rocks and stones on the wagons and weigh them so that they were paid properly. No one had ever done that before. So they were definitely innovators in the business. All right, I'm going to take you inside now with, at the time, this was considered a very modern office. I'm going to show you all the highlights that they have and what they use to keep the business running. Come on inside. The Mulligans were one of the families to immigrate over from Ireland, but they worked extremely hard, the whole family. And they were allowed some luxuries that no one else had, which you'll see in the office, including a coal-burning stove, which initially they bartered to get the coal and traded limestone for. So they had heat in here. They also incorporated the scale that weighed the stones. So when they sold them for fertilizer, when they sold it for roads, they were paid properly. So this office was actually one of the first to integrate electricity when it became available. And it was priceless because they were able to communicate with the outside through telegraphs, typewriters, and a telephone when it came. So it was extremely important that they kept up with the changing times to keep the business running. So the Mulligans were one of the wealthiest families when they came over and immigrated from Ireland. That gave them a big advantage on getting the business started. So when they built their office, they worked very, very hard and their whole family was involved. Do you have a question?
What's with the desk with all the holes?
That's a really good question. Actually, that was one of the first modern filing systems. By having all those holes in, they could keep all their clients' paperwork separately, their payments, and all their information. So they knew exactly where everything was going. It was a very innovative system at the time. All right, next I want to take you out to the actual quarry so you can see the rock cliffs, you can see the limestone for itself and find out how it was processed and all these different things. All right, so this is what's left of the rock quarry. Before it was started to process, it would extend almost another 50 yards out into the museum village, but by processing it and blowing it up, this is what we have left. It was a very long and dangerous process harvesting the limestone from the wall. It would start by drilling holes in and inserting dynamite to blow out chunks. It was a very difficult and very dangerous process.
I have a question.
Oh, sure. What is it?
How do you move the big rocks to the grinder?
Very good question. It wasn't easy. It was done by hand using picks and sledgehammers to break it up into pieces that were actually light enough to be dragged by horses over to the screen house. We're here now with the stone crusher, which is the most amazing piece of equipment for the whole quarry processing, and the most important, because this is what was used after the pieces of limestone are blown off into chunks. They come down here to be processed into smaller chunks. So that's what starts this all off. And from there, they enter inside the screen house where it all happens. All right, so the reason the screen house is so big is, as we saw before, it starts out as huge boulders going into it, and they get broken down into different sizes for different uses. And then they all come out the chutes and get loaded onto wagons or into barrels for processing. You have a question for me?
How long does it take for the big rocks to turn into little stones?
That is a great question because the different wheels they're put in. Huge rocks obviously take a really long time. It could take up to a week to get them down to this size. So they just keep spinning and spinning, and they're always alternating processing so that different stones are ready at different times. You're going to witness now another amazing piece of history here, because the conveyor belt that processed the rocks from the quarry still operates. And it's going to show you how it took the big pieces of limestone, broke them up, went up the conveyor belt, and continued processing to the finished product. Amazing that they thought about that all those years ago. And it's a simple process, and it still operates today, doing the same thing. All right, let's take a close-up look at the kilns. So basically, a kiln is another name for a furnace, an oven. This is where they basically burn the rock. Now, they burned it in the different degrees and levels, depending on the size. When they used it for fertilizer, it'd have to be as fine as possible, and it took a very long time to process. But these pits got extremely hot. You couldn't get close. And as we told you before, when Peg Leg and everybody kept an eye on here to make sure it didn't start any fires. So again, the final process in the quarry was burning the limestone so that we can make all the finished products. So answer the question.
How long would the firing process take?
Well, that's a good question. There were different levels of it, but like to do the final and the finest, I should say, the finest processing, which was going to be the fertilizer, it would probably burn for at least 5 days to a fine powder, and when it was cool enough to shovel out. So they really had to keep an eye on it. Another big part of the quarry history is harvesting ice. The Mulligans looked for any way they could to make money, especially in the off season, and ice needed to be harvested because back then no one had refrigerators or places to store it, and they needed to keep their food cold. So during the deepest months of winter and late February is when the ice harvest began. They used a lot of the tools that you see here to cut it and have it transported into what they called ice houses, where were basically big holes in the ground, because the longer and deeper you dug, the colder the ground was. So they used to separate the blocks of ice covered with sawdust to keep it as cold as possible for as long as possible. But there were a lot of different ways to do it. They incorporated different hand saws, saws that were pulled by horses and wagons to cut through, and then they used tongs like you see behind me here, also to pick up the pieces and cut them all into smaller pieces. It was a very difficult job, and once they started, sometimes they would work easily 10 hours or more a day until the ice was harvested, because they had to get it all as much in as possible before it started to get warm. You have a question?
Where did they find the ice?
Well, that was the benefit of living right here on the river. Okay, that's why when settlers came in early, the first thing they looked for was water. And they had the benefit of this great river, the South Raritan, right next to us, where they were able to harvest the power of the water to use in the mill, but it also froze over, and they had all the ice they wanted. They just had to figure out how to get it. And it wasn't an easy process. Another question.
How did they transport the ice from the river up to the ice house?
That's a really good question. Similar to the way they did it with the limestone, they would break the ice into manageable pieces that weren't too heavy to move. Then they would cut around them with a big saw, tie ropes around them, and then they would have to have their horses out and actually draw them and pull them out of the water, have them dragged across to the end of the river where they can mount them onto the back of a wagon and get them to the ice house. Very difficult and very heavy process. Everyone was involved with trying to get as much ice as possible in to get through the winter. I'm on the porch here of what we call the tenant house. And the reason it's called the tenant house is because tenants live here. A lot of families lived here that worked at the mill. It was just a lot more convenient for them to be on property because the mill and the quarry ran long hours. So being here made it a lot easier to come to and from work and be available whenever they're needed. But it was very crowded in there. They tried to fit as many people as they possibly could. Of course, being right across from the river was a huge advantage, using that to eat, clean their clothes, and just generally live. The tenant house was a very difficult building to maintain, being in such close proximity to the quarry. Every time it blasted, it shattered rocks onto the roof. The vibration would break windows. So they really had to prepare when they knew that was happening. So a lot of times they were covered up with wood and making preparations to keep the children inside so nobody got hurt. At one point later on, when the work waned out during the seasons, they turned part of the tenant house into like a general store. So they were able to sell goods. So even though they got to live here for free, they still had to buy some of the materials that they needed to live. And this was a convenient spot to open up and sell them some goods. Oh, you have a question for me?
Did they have to pay rent, and if so, how much did they have to pay?
That's a really good question. Well, one of the benefits, if you remember we talked about before, pay was very little here. Sometimes usually about 12 cents a day. So one of the benefits they had was being able to stay here rent-free and with their families. So they thought, especially the Mulligan family from the quarry, that if they were here and their families together, they'd work harder for them, which was actually true. So this here is Peg Leg Shack. No place on the mill grounds has more folklore and stories associated than this building right here. But the truth is, it's not that exciting. It was part of being built here for the workers who worked on the quarry. And the reason it was put here is because the kilns would burn the limestone all night and the fires would stay really hot. So someone had to be here all the time to watch it to make sure there were no wildfires. So Peg Leg was actually a worker and a friend of the Mulligan family who did only have one leg from a childhood accident. So they liked him, they felt sorry for him, he was a good worker. So he was in here for most of the time that the grounds were operating as a rock quarry. You have a question?
How much money would the person living in here make?
Okay, well there was a big difference back then in those times. Are you ready? A worker that like Peg Leg made about 12 cents a day working in the quarry. And not only did he have that, he risked his life because it was a very dangerous job. But back then there wasn't much work to be had by anyone. So 12 cents was about as much as anybody could get. But you got to remember, back then things didn't cost a whole lot more. And here they fed him, he had a place to live he didn't have to pay for, so he was able to save up until he was able to leave and move on. So Peg Leg had a very important function on being here. By being right across from the kilns, he could keep an eye on them all night when everyone else was asleep to make sure there were no fires and everything was protected. So the place could not have survived without him. So now that we've seen all the aspects from start to finish, from the rocks coming off of there, coming out of the kilns, being shipped out and being processed, you've seen how difficult and hard life it was living here when it was a quarry. So I really hope that you got a lot out of this.